Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to hold off for the first 60 seconds just to let everybody join, get situated, grab a drink, grab a snack, and we'll be right with you in a moment to start the webinar. Okay, just a few more seconds here. And if you're just joining us now, we're going to hold off until the next 30 seconds, just to let everybody join and get situated. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So first and foremost, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Amanda, and I'm DWDC's program coordinator. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Taylor. Before we get started, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather here today is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. These nations continue to experience ongoing colonization and displacement. Today, Toronto is covered under Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. Dying with Dignity Canada is also mindful of broken treaties that have occurred across Turtle Island and recognize our responsibility as treaty peoples to engage in a continuous process of truth and reconciliation with all peoples across the land. So I am very thrilled to welcome you today. It's through our webinars that we aim to provide you with information, key takeaways, as well as to create a space for conversation on end-of-life topics alongside the professionals that know it best. Before I welcome our speakers today, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Everyone on the call today is muted, but there is an opportunity for you to submit your questions. To do so, please type your questions into the question bar, which you can also see here on your screen, and we will read it out for you at the end. In the interest of time, we ask that you please try to keep your questions as concise and clear as possible. And of course, while we're going to try to get to as many audience questions as possible, unfortunately, we may not get to everybody. If you have any outstanding questions or questions that are quite personal in nature, we ask that you please email us at support@dyingwithdignity.ca and we will follow up with you. On a final note, this session will be recorded, so there's no need for you to take notes if you don't wish to. And there's also going to be a post-webinar survey that will pop up on your screen after the webinar, which allows you to provide us with your much needed feedback. And if you'd like to make sure that you receive regular updates from DWDC on upcoming webinars, events, and advocacy initiatives, make sure you're subscribed to any of the social media platforms that you see here on your screen. We're also going to include a link to our newsletter in the chat for anybody that's interested. And now, to introduce today's speakers. Ingrid Kuhlman is the chair of Lífsvirðing, the Icelandic Right to Die Society established in 2017, which works to foster an open and constructive public conversation about assisted dying and advocates for legislation that would allow it under clearly defined conditions and strict safeguards. In addition to her own advocacy work, Ingrid is an experienced trainer and consultant at her own company, Þekkingarmiðlun, which provides training, workshops, and professional development for individuals and organizations. So, Ingrid, thanks so much for joining us. Next
Thank
up,
you.
we have Justin McKenna, who is a long-standing member of End of Life Ireland, whose advocacy for end-of-life choice is deeply personal and informed by decades of professional experience as a solicitor. Through his long-standing legal work on advanced healthcare directives, enduring powers of attorney, and decision-making capacity, as well as his experience supporting a loved one through illness, Justin became a committed advocate for justice, compassion, and equality at the end of life. He's represented End of Life Ireland at the World Federation of Right to Die Societies in 2022 and 2024, in addition to testifying before an Irish parliamentary committee on the topic of assisted dying. So, Justin, thank you so much for joining us. So first and foremost, for today's session, we're going to be hosting a mixed format webinar. So we're going to start with a short presentation from each of our speakers and then transition into a small interview. So without further ado, I'm going to now pass it on to Ingrid, who's graciously prepared a presentation for today. So thanks so much again, Ingrid.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and a very good afternoon or evening to all of you, wherever you're located. I'm going to talk a bit about the situation in Iceland when it comes to assisted dying. And as you probably know, assisted dying is still prohibited under the General Penal Code. Um, it prohibits killing someone at their urgent request with a penalty up to 3 years, and it also prohibits assisting or encouraging suicide with penalties up to 1 year's imprisonment or fines, and higher penalties if there's a selfish motive. We, however, do have, according to the Icelandic law, we allow for the refusal or discontinuation of treatment under the Patients' Rights Act. But our foundation, our society was founded in 2017 in a response to a growing need for open, informed, and humane conversation about death and the process of dying. And the name Lífsvirðing, which you pronounced very, very nicely, Amanda, it means respect for life. Today we have 432 members. That might not sound a lot, but in a country of only 400,000 people, that represents a substantial level of engagement, equivalent to more than 43,000 members if scaled to the Canadian population. We also have a very strong public presence with around 4,800 followers on Facebook. And like Amanda mentioned already, we have three main goals: to foster this dialogue on assisted dying, and to work towards legislation in Iceland, and of course also to emphasize education and cooperation. So it's very important to provide reliable information. We organize conferences, meetings, and we also collaborate with sister societies, especially in the Nordic countries. But throughout all of this, our guiding principle is respect. Respect for individuals, for complexity, for the profound seriousness of decisions at the end of life. And I got involved in assisted dying because of my personal experience. My father was among the first people in the Netherlands to have his wish for assisted dying fulfilled legally. Of course, doctors had been providing assisted dying before 2002, but when the law came into effect, he applied for assisted dying and died 11 days later. He had been diagnosed with a brain tumor in 1999. Surgery was not possible, and 2 rounds of very intensive radiotherapy failed to stop the disease. His condition deteriorated steadily, and despite morphine and other pain relief, he suffered greatly. And above all, he wanted to die with dignity. So when the law came into force, he asked his general practitioner to help him with assisted dying, and he died where he wanted, how he wanted, in the environment he wanted. And at his funeral, we played this song, My Way. It represents very well what he stood for. It was also his favorite song. He did it his way. And of course, losing a loved one is always painful, but when nothing remains except suffering, what matters is that death comes with as little suffering and as much dignity as possible. So this experience shaped my understanding of end-of-life rights, really. But there are also other things that I find very important. For me, end-of-life rights are about autonomy, about dignity, about protection from avoidable suffering, and also about being honest, how we talk about death and dying. And of course, these three things are so important. For example, dignity. Can a person still recognize himself in his own life despite illness? dependency and loss of control. Autonomy, of course, for me means that at the end of life, you are still a moral agent. You are capable of deciding what matters to you when cure is no longer possible. So that is also very important to me. And third, of course, protection from avoidable suffering. We know that modern medicine can often prolong life more effectively than it can relieve suffering. Palliative care is very essential, but it doesn't help everyone in every situation. And end-of-life rights arise precisely at those limits, I think. But after we founded our society, we, of course, have had a couple of milestones. The foundation of our society helped consolidate advocacy, education, and public discussion around assisted dying. And then in the years after that, the debate became more visible, more sustained. Media coverage increased and professional voices became more prominent. At a parliamentary level, resolutions have been introduced since 2017, which of course reflects persistence, but it also reflects the slow pace of institutional change. After many years of resolutions, we eventually in 2023, Parliament instructed the Minister of Health to do an opinion poll among healthcare professionals and also patient organizations and the public as well. And this was about their attitudes towards assisted dying. In 2024, the first bill on assisted dying was formally introduced in our parliament by MPs affiliated with the Reform Party. And this last year, in 2025, a group of MPs submitted a parliamentary proposal calling on Parliament to instruct the Minister of Health to prepare and present a bill authorizing assisted dying. And this hasn't gone through Parliament yet. But in our assessment, we find that attitudes towards assisted dying have somewhat deteriorated because we have a new center-left government, and at present the Reform Party is the only party in Parliament whose platform explicitly supports assisted dying. However, we know of many other MPs that support the issue, so we, of course, have to keep hopeful. But I would like to show you the results of polls that have been done in Iceland. This first graph shows that public support for assisted dying has been consistently high over time since 2015. You see that around 3 out of 4 people have supported assisted dying, with only minor fluctuations across these years, so these past 10 years. This, of course, tells us that support is not temporary, it's not event-driven either, but it reflects a stable, long-term public position. And of course, this matters to us because it shows that society, Icelandic society, is already engaged with and supportive of greater autonomy and dignity at the end of life. So the key challenge is therefore not whether the public is ready for this conversation, but more how legislation can responsibly reflect those long-held views. And we will be doing a new survey this spring to provide the most up-to-date on information on public attitudes. But we have another graph to show you, and this has to do with the support from physicians and other healthcare professionals, and that has changed a lot over time, which of course gives us hope. In 1995, support was very low, 6% among physicians and 12% among nurses. And of course, at that time, assisted dying was not yet part of mainstream ethical or policy debate. Then 15 years later, support had increased to 80%, 18% among physicians and 20% among nurses. And while still a minority view, this of course marks its emergence as a legitimate topic within healthcare. The most significant change appeared in 2021 when a majority of physicians, 54%, and nurses, 78%, supported assisted dying. And in 2023, when the Ministry of Health conducted the survey I mentioned earlier, support had even risen further. 56% of physicians support assisted dying at the moment, and 86% among nurses. We also had another group that was added to the survey, licensed practical nurses, and their support is 81%. There were also patients' organizations who took part in the survey, and there we also saw very high support, or 84.4%. So I guess 2 points stand out. Support has increased consistently across all groups, and it's the highest among those who are closest to patients' everyday suffering, like nurses and licensed practical nurses. Of course, these are the groups most directly engaged with prolonged illness, end-of-life care, and of course, their support brings a very important perspective to the discussion, to the debate. But taken together, this has shown that assisted dying in Iceland is no longer only a public opinion issue. It has become a mainstream position within healthcare, particularly among those working most closely with patients at the end of life. This concludes my presentation. We'll answer more questions later on, but I would like to give the floor to Justin McKenna from End of Life Ireland. Justin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ingrid. That was very interesting. Well, I'd like to say hi to all our friends in Canada, and thank you for inviting me to come along and speak today. So my story is going to be a little more, let's say, interesting from the historical point of view. I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why I became involved in this movement. But I'd like to begin by going back to my childhood, if you like, as a schoolboy, reading Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens wrote Bleak House, a book that was centered around a case called Jarndyce and Jarndyce. And this was a rather arcane way of dealing with wills and inheritances. So he made a book out of it. He made a novel. And I was absorbed by it. It was always decided that I would be a lawyer when I left school. So I took this with me, and within weeks of starting in 1973, I found two such cases. And these would have been regarded as chancery cases involving minors and what they would call persons of unsound mind. So this brings me to a point where I'm looking at the law. Bleak House was written in 1853, but the Wards of Court system goes back a bit longer than that. And in 1871, the lunacy regulations in Ireland came about in order to introduce regulations as to how to deal with people who suffered from mental health issues. And the persons of unsound mind, as they would be described, would be people who would be unable to make decisions on their own account. And also, the law applied to minors who would be children under the age of 18 who might have been left as orphans. These cases in Chancery would go on for decades. And in the case that I remember when I joined this old law firm, two cases had about 50 and 40 years between them, respectively, I should say. Uh, and I was fascinated to see how these cases could trundle on for years and years and years until eventually the money that was there had been absorbed and dissipated in legal fees. However, that might be a jaundiced view of taking the law as it stood, and it was clearly something that had to change. So change came about in gradual terms. So the first case that I came across involved a young girl called Lucy Chamberlain, who in 1972, just around about the time I was leaving school, went into hospital for a procedure and suffered irreversible brain damage, as a result of which she was in a vegetative state in hospital, and she remained in that condition for 22 years. At which time her mother, Margaret, decided to sue the hospital with a view to allowing her daughter to die. This was the first of the right to die cases that were to occur in Ireland. And she succeeded in the High Court. And then the case was appealed by the Catholic institution that owned the hospital, um, and the doctors who worked within it. And also, of course, the guardian of Lucy, because Lucy, of course, was a person of unsound mind and therefore a ward of court. Well, the case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the decision to allow her to die. Now, but because the Suicide Act of 1993 had only recently been passed, there was doubt as to whether any medical person attending on her might suffer the consequences of the criminal aspect of assisting somebody to die. And as a result, she died after was it 8 days at home in the care of nurses and one doctor who acted voluntarily. Now, in 33 years, there's never been a successful prosecution for assisted dying, despite the fact that it's on the criminal books. And it remains there to this day. We haven't succeeded yet in changing that law to allow people to seek medical assistance in dying. But the fight goes on. In 1996, arising directly as a result of the same case that was concluded in 96 involving Lucy Chamberlain, the Powers of Attorney Act was passed. And in so doing, it introduced in Ireland for the first time a system or method of enabling people to have decisions made on their behalf by attorneys on an enduring basis. These were known as enduring powers of attorney, and they changed the manner in which we looked upon people who suffered from the inability mentally to handle decisions on their own part. However, this was only a means to an end. And in 2013, we had a landmark case involving a lady called Mary Fleming. She suffered from multiple sclerosis, and a case was brought by her to the upper courts in Ireland uh, in order to enable herself, to end her own life in a dignified way, rather than to see her pain and suffering linger and that she would die a slow death. She wanted the ability to choose how she should die. Now, the Supreme Court established in the first instance that there is no constitutional right in Ireland to die. There is a constitutional right to live, but there is nothing to prevent the legislature from introducing a law that would allow the law to recognize assisted dying. And that was a momentous step along the route of bringing the law into order. However, it didn't go any further because the political appetite to have the law introduced simply wasn't there. Then I beg your pardon, in 2015, shortly after, Ireland ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and in so doing, recognized as a human right the ability to accept certain principles. We call them the FRIDA principles, and these involved freedom, respect, equality, dignity, and autonomy. And these are the basic elements that go towards establishing the right to determine your own decisions, and that they should never be denied. So we go back to the lunacy regulations of 1871, whereby it was all about status. You were either sane or you were insane. You were either a person of sound mind or you were a person of unsound mind. And it had language that was just antediluvian. We would have expressions such as idiot being a description of a person who would be unable from birth to make a decision, or uh, what was the other one? I'm forgetting now the second one. Um, but never mind. Just trying to give you a flavor for the inappropriate manner in which language was used in Victorian times, and how times had changed, and it was time now to introduce those changes and legislate so that we could feel free to live in the modern society in accordance with modern ideas. So the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act was passed, and the Office of the Director of Support Services, Decision Support Services, was set up in 2015. However, the means to doing it wasn't adopted until 2023. It took 8 years to perfect the codes of conduct and the guidelines needed to operate this system of functional testing as opposed to status testing. And then in fact, shortly afterwards, the End of Life Ireland group, which I represent, was established by our leader, Janie Lazar. And a small group of us got together with the view to advocating for change. In in the course of this time, two private members' bills were introduced to the Oireachtas, which is the Irish House of Parliament, or Houses of Parliament, and the first one failed, and the second one was brought in 2020 and achieved its readings initially and moved on. I'll come back to it in a second, but my own personal experience then was peaked during this time. In 2019, my wife Claire was diagnosed with motor neuron disease, and for 2 years she suffered. She died in 2021 in a hospice on her own. She didn't have the right to choose how she could die or would have liked to have died. She died I suppose COVID didn't help. There were lockdowns at the time, and it wasn't possible for her family to be with her in the hospice when she died. This was undignified and it was unnecessary. It was stressful for my children, all of whom now are adults, of course, and have children of their own. But it was an unpleasant experience, and one that I felt should never be repeated by anybody. No, nobody needs to die in those terms. It's only a matter of allowing people at the end of their lives to die in a dignified way. Uh, as I said, in 2020, this private members bill that was going through stumbled, and it was referred to committee. The Justice Committee that sat decided that a special committee should be set up of the joint houses of the Parliament, and it sat. There were 14 members on the committee, and for 9 months they deliberated on what should be done at a legislative level. And during that time, our group in End of Life Ireland were invited to testify before the committee And we did so. And I'm delighted to say that we were also influential in introducing speakers from all over the world by virtue of our association through the World Federation of Right to Die Societies, and how around the world there are other groups like us who are advocating for the same changes to take place. And the testimony that they gave would helped enormously to persuade the committee that it wasn't just inevitable, it was necessary to change the law. And they made 38 recommendations to say that it would and should be introduced. However, the government fell and an election took place and a new government came about. So at this point, we have a government that has no appetite for changing or acting on moral issues such as this, and so therefore the matter has been, let's say, parked to one side. I'm sure it's going to come around at some stages as long as we continue to agitate, because there is a will to do it among politicians, but it isn't. It doesn't garner votes. That's probably the difficulty they have. Uh, as I say, in 2023, the law under the 2015 Act came through, and we now have a system where they've done a digital arrangement for enduring powers of attorney. But it also introduced another development, which was the introduction of advanced healthcare directives. And this means that for the very first time, there's a legally enforceable way that people can say to their doctors that we would choose or could choose how we do not wish to die. We could leave a directive to say that we don't wish to have resuscitation in certain circumstances, or artificial feeding, or to be stuck to a ventilation machine. These advances during 23 have made significant changes to the general outlook. And as I said, while we testified before this committee, we are now acknowledged, the group that I represent, End of Life Ireland, as perhaps the foremost group of advocates in this area, and we would be a go-to organization with a view to media encounters and so on. And we're not necessarily we're not doctors. We're basic amateur advocates. If you put it that way, we're not funded in any way. Although we do get some donations which are helpfully used. In 2024, for instance, we were able to host the World Federation conference here in Dublin, and I think Ingrid attended. And this year, the conference is being held in Tokyo. However, I don't want to drag on. I think I've overstepped my time at this stage, Amanda, so forgive me for that. And I perhaps withdraw now and wait for some questions and answers. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you both so much for your presentations, talking a little bit about how you get to today with the status of the right to die movements in Iceland and Ireland. So we're going to transition now into our interview questions. First, we're going to do a deep dive into Ireland, and then we'll do the same for Iceland before we move to our Q&A period. So Justin, first off, how would you describe the general cultural perspectives of the Irish peoples on death, dying, and grief?
Well, you take death as a subject. The Irish love it. I trace back to some literary origins and look at James Joyce, an author of which I always enjoy. It, but Joyce wrote Ulysses, and in it there's a chapter devoted to the subject of death, and he entitled it Hades. And in Finnegan's Wake, of course, the entire book is about a wake. Now, what is a wake? In Ireland, when somebody dies, traditionally the body is brought home and placed in a box and put on a table. And I know growing up, as I would go around the country, many houses around Ireland would have funeral tables, and big enough to accommodate a coffin, and the coffin would be left open. And the neighbors and friends, the relations would all be invited around to the house. And there would be singing, there would be music, there would be, of course, whiskey. And the idea would be to wake the body, wake the dead. And of course, that's just a means of ensuring that the poor victim is gone. And this isn't necessarily a sad occasion because it's a moment when Irish people like to reflect and rejoice in a life well lived. Now, of course, there are occasions when it's very hard to do that because the tragedy is huge. But if it is, there's always humor. It could be black humor, and the Irish are great for doing it, and they're great for getting to the source of it. And Joyce in Finnegan's Wake does exactly that. So that would be, from a cultural perspective, how the Irish would look upon death, dying, and coping with grief, and how we support each other in the process. And the funerals here tend to occur within a day or two of the death having occurred. So that within a week, it's all the first phase, let's say, has taken its course. And then we have a month's mind, uh, a month later, when we can sit down to discuss some of the more the business-like aspects of somebody's passing. So that would be, in a general way, how I would describe the Irish perspective.
Thank you. For my next question, I'd like to ask, you know, Ireland has undergone several social reforms related to bodily autonomy and human rights since the early 90s. For example, the legalization of divorce and abortion more recently in 2018. I'm wondering if that shift in policy has impacted the perceptions and attitudes towards assisted dying and the right to die.
Well, well, certainly from a personal level, I can say that by the time we sat down at Janie's invitation to discuss this as a worthy cause to pursue, we had all experiences ourselves of supporting the campaigns that had taken place previously in relation to the subjects that you mentioned,
Mm.
to abortion. The abortion debate was all about repealing an amendment that had been taken to ban abortion through the Constitution of Ireland, and it over the years was a source of great contention. And the repeal of that amendment took place a few years ago, and it was successful. And it inspired others to consider another referendum, and that was on the introduction of a law that would allow same-sex marriage.
Mhm.
And Ireland was the first country, I know, as far as I'm aware, in the world to vote in a provision like that that would allow same-sex marriage. So this again was a vibrant aspect to life here in Ireland at a time when we were discussing in a philosophical way how we should seek to move to another level and continue to help with change, with positive change, working for compassionate, humanistic reasons. And we chose then the subject of voluntary assisted dying. And we then, as we were working on this, we became aware that this was going on in other parts of the world as well. And there were changes taking place uh, in other countries. Uh, and so that gave us the courage to do it. And we noticed, and it was clear that others were with us, and we were getting quite a lot of good support here, uh, despite institutional resistance. So that shift in policy uh, has impacted, I believe, on the perception and attitudes towards assisted dying.
Yeah, absolutely. As a final question before we move into a deep dive on Iceland, I'm curious if you could just give us a bit more information about the general consensus today, let's say, on assisted dying from the general public, so just general community members, clinicians, allied healthcare professionals, those who work in the healthcare space, and then politicians.
Well, in order to gauge general consensus, one is inclined to go to the media. So, in media terms, we have the mainline media, which would be the printed version and the television. And it has gradually absorbed the debate. And I know from the various interviews I've conducted that there's a greater sense of sympathy with the cause of the patient, with the cause of the person who's dying. And the idea of choice seems to be more palatable than it was, and people are beginning to discuss it. But it's still not as widely spoken about as perhaps the divorce or abortion topics would have been carried. And those are now taken for granted. But the general public has taken it on board, and any uh, testing polls that I've seen have all been positively in favor of a change. Clinicians and allied healthcare professionals, um, uh, on the other hand, have taken a conservative view as bodies and have decided that change is not a good thing because if it isn't broken, why fix it? There's a sense or a feeling that palliative care at the end of life is good enough. There shouldn't be any need to go the extra point uh, and allow the patient the ability to determine how the end should arise at the end. Uh, the but having witnessed it in the case of my own wife, I find it very hard to see a difference between palliative sedation and assisted dying. They, as far as I could see, uh, Claire had uh, three different drugs being pumped into her over a period of 6 days before she finally succumbed. Now, she was pain-free, but all of this wasn't necessary. The process of dying had clearly accelerated. When I last saw her sitting up in bed, she was sending texts to her tennis pals discussing matches that were about to take place at the weekend. And that was the last time. I never got a chance to say goodbye to her because I thought the next morning she would be there. As it happens anyway, she wasn't able to speak. She had lost her ability to speech. But that was the point. On Monday, she was dead through a process that had been brought in and maintained by the palliative care consultants. But the politicians then, as I've already described, just don't have an appetite for something that could be could doom their careers by tempting fate and inviting people to vote with them on changes where the institutions would have laid certain lines, particularly on religious grounds, uh, to deny the end of life in the hands of the patient. Uh, so we are really waiting for the moment when the weighing scales, if you like, tip over, and that's going to be helped by the general public, and that's what we're really trying to do is to keep it there in the public mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for taking me through this deep dive on Ireland. Ingrid, I'm going to tap you next to talk a bit about Iceland. And same question for you to start with. How would you describe the general cultural perspectives of the Icelandic peoples on death, dying, and grief?
Well, I would say Icelandic perspectives on death have shifted across time because and now I'm going to refer back to the Icelandic sagas. Their death is portrayed as a natural and honorable event. Men fall in battle, go to Valhalla, or lie slain on the battlefield. And death marked the end of the body, but not the end of meaning or memory. And farewells were social events in which people gathered and actually actively participated. So there was no need to conceal or silence death because it was visible throughout the fabric of social life. In Iceland, like in Ireland, we also had wakes until the late 19th century or even well into the 20th century. And when someone died, the body usually remained at home, laid out in the main living space. Family members, neighbors, friends gathered to ensure that the deceased was not left alone. And stories were told, memories were shared. And but today, contemporary Icelandic culture tends to approach death with a blend of pragmatism, emotional restraint, and quiet intimacy. Death can be discussed calmly in personal settings, but it remains a sensitive topic and often avoided topic as well, particularly when it comes to anticipating death, discussing suffering, or articulating end-of-life wishes. And grief is very often experienced privately, shaped by strong cultural expectations of coping and not burdening others. And this, of course, creates a tension in which death is acknowledged as inevitable, yet the conditions and experiences of dying remain partially silenced. So it's a very complex matter. It's not entirely taboo, but we don't discuss it very often in an open way. And I'm myself born and raised in Holland. In the Netherlands, I have a very different experience. We, of course, in the Netherlands, assisted dying was legalized in 2002. And there you can expect when you go to a birthday party to have to be questioned about your wishes, your end-of-life wishes. That is something that is unthinkable in Iceland.
Thank you. Next question. Iceland, like many Nordic countries, are considered more progressive when it comes to human rights, bodily autonomy, as you just mentioned, in the Netherlands being one of, I believe, the first country to provide assisted dying in 2002, compared to other nations in the European Union and certainly other areas across the world. And I'm curious if this reputation or history translates to that same support for the right to die or the assisted dying movement at large.
Well, yes, you're right. We have a very strong reputation for human rights, gender equality, and bodily autonomy. And of course, this should be an important foundation for discussions about the right to die. And we see it, for example, in the 2019 revision of Iceland's abortion law. This strengthened reproductive autonomy, and it affirmed also the principle that women should have authority over deeply personal decisions about their own bodies. And as you might know, in Iceland, women can now have an abortion until week 22. So I would say that these values like self-determination, respect for individual choice resonates strongly in the Icelandic context. However, support for bodily autonomy in areas such as reproductive rights doesn't translate straightforwardly into support for assisted dying, unfortunately. End-of-life decisions raise different concerns, particularly regarding the protection of vulnerable people, medical ethics, and collective responsibility. So as a result, while the underlying values might align, the application in the context of assisted dying remains contested. unfortunately.
Mhm. For my last question, I'm curious again, just as I had asked with Justin about the general consensus on assisted dying
Mhm.
from the general public, healthcare providers, and allied healthcare members, and then politicians, as you mentioned. And you did touch a bit on this on your presentation as well
Mhm.
about the changes in government and having to start a bit from scratch there. But curious if you have anything else to add.
Well, yes, I do. There is growing, if I talk about the general public first, there is growing openness about among the general public to discuss assisted dying, especially in cases involving terminal diseases and severe suffering. And many people express support in principle, but at the same time, this support is often conditional rather than absolute. So it tends to emphasize the importance of strict safeguards and protection for vulnerable individuals, indicating that while there is receptiveness to the idea, there's also the expectation of careful and responsible regulation, which is, of course, something we support in our society. When it comes to clinicians and healthcare professionals, you put it into words. Justin, you said that there wasn't a big appetite. We see in Iceland that the Icelandic Medical Association doesn't have an appetite for assisted dying. We, however, see that, like I showed you in the graph, in the last two surveys, we see rising support from clinicians and other healthcare professionals for assisted dying. But like you mentioned also, Justin, in Ireland, many emphasize the importance of strengthening palliative care. And often they say that should be enough. So we don't need assisted dying. And they express concerns about ethical burden, role conflict, and potential pressure on clinicians. But we are very fortunate to have a group of physicians at the moment that have actively and publicly expressed support for assisted dying. They highlight patient autonomy, the limits of even high quality palliative care in reducing suffering, but we have no unified professional position from healthcare professionals at the moment. And well, among politicians, there is cross-party interest. We have a new government, which means that we have 36 new MPs, and some of them have never even thought about the issue of assisted dying. So we're actively lobbying these days. But we see both support there, but also clear hesitation, and many support the continued discussion, further explanation without committing to legislative change. So it's a complex situation, and it's been dealt with caution.
Mhm. Okay. Thank you both so much for that deep dive. We just have a few more questions before we move on to the Q&A period. And for either one of you, feel free to jump in where it feels best. So there are several neighboring nations in the European Union and across the world that have permitted or expanded assisted dying, the Benelux countries, more recently in the United Kingdom, and of course, the assisted dying program here in Canada. And I'm curious if these developments in these countries, both on your side of the pond and our side of the pond, have had any impact on the momentum, the movement for assisted dying in either of your countries, and if so, what does that impact look like?
Well, if you like, I'll start by
Yeah.
addressing that. It's, I suppose, it's more by way of observation, but if I could just give you some thoughts about locally, and I'm talking now about between Ireland and the UK. So our neighbouring country is the United Kingdom, but the United Kingdom is broken into disparate sections because they have different parliaments, and you have England and Wales who are at the moment debating this in the House of Lords, but there's a filibuster in place, and that is designed to derail the passage of the terminally ill adults end of life bill, which in its own way, as a title to a bill, is complicated and it's impossibly because they're discussing over 1,000 amendments to this piece of legislation. They'll never get through the debate because it's destined to end, I think, in end of April or May. But it illustrates in a graphic way the idiosyncrasies people introduce when discussing the subject of assisted dying. And in a way, I'm thinking they may be doing us a favor because they'll have written the script and it'll all be seen as such an act of futility. The Channel Islands have passed the assisted dying Jersey law. The Isle of Man has passed the Isle of Man Assisted Dying Act, which was enacted in March of 2025. In Scotland, the Assisted Dying for Terminally Ill Adults Scotland Bill is going through its third stage and should become law this year. And at the end of at the other side of the globe, you've got in Australia, the six parliaments there all voted for change, and New Zealand held a referendum for change. In Victoria, they've now reviewed the legislation that they brought in 2017 in order to say, well, what's going wrong? Why isn't it working as well as it should? Because there are shortcomings. And those shortcomings have been addressed by, in one case at least, removing the gag clause, which prevents consultant doctors from raising the subject of assisted dying as an option. While it's a legal place, it's illegal there to do it. And the position, if I could just reel back a little bit on this idea, what has become more topical and more frequent is the rate of the traffic to Switzerland through Dignitas or Pegasus to help people who are genuinely at that point in their lives when they can bear it no longer. And they have to just take the bull by the horns and travel so that in a country that recognizes it and doesn't have residential rules, they can avail of the service and die in peace. And this now is developing. There's more of it. And it should be a signal to any country that bans it, that there is a crying need by people who are having to resort to these things. And of course, the tragedy is that they cannot go accompanied for fear that they would endanger their own friends or family in joining with them in something that could be seen to be assistance. So there is definitely a stronger, more sympathetic outlook as a result of these changes that are taking place all around us.
Thank you. Ingrid, same for you.
Yeah, I also think that international developments have had a significant influence on the Icelandic debate because, like, if we think about the last 10 years, we have seen so many changes, both in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere. And legislation and expansion of assisted dying have, in all these countries across the world, have shifted the discussion in Iceland. So these countries, they function as reference points. They offer real world evidence about safeguards, oversight, and also things that might need to be adjusted. And the Dutch and also Belgian models have been particularly influential in Iceland. And the reason for this is, of course, that I am myself from the Netherlands, so I know how the system works there. And we also have one board member from Switzerland. And her husband, he went to Dignitas in 2013. to have assisted suicide. That's the only way for us Icelanders today. Of course, we don't have legislation in the other Nordic countries, and that's why we are also meeting annually. Canada's experience is also sharpening awareness in Iceland about how, for example, eligibility criteria and safeguards can change over time. But at the same time, developments across the world also sometimes temper momentum because critics, they frequently point to the perceived expansions in other jurisdictions as evidence of a potential slippery slope. And we spend a lot of time responding to misinformation or oversimplified narratives imported from abroad. And particularly claims that misrepresent how assisted dying is regulated and practiced in other countries. So it's both, we learn a lot from other countries and we see the same story everywhere where people are against it. For example, those in palliative care, they often use the same arguments. So it's both positive and negative. But we can learn a lot from countries like Canada and the Netherlands, definitely.
Thank you both so much. That concludes my interview questions. So we're now going to move on to audience Q&A, and we'll start with a mixture of questions, both for registration and those submitted live. So thank you so much to our supporters who are joining us today for those questions. So for anybody who wants to jump in, please feel free to go ahead. First up, this audience member is curious about if either of you have, spoken or met with someone who was originally against assisted dying, but thereafter changed their perspective. And if so, what inspired that change?
Yes, I have had many discussions with people that changed their minds, and very often before they change their minds, they say, I don't know about assisted dying. I find it somewhat scaring. Then when they have a personal experience, for example, a husband who dies in an undignified way or another loved one, they come to me and say, now I know what you're talking about. And they're actually for assisted dying. So it's often personal experiences that shape their change of mind.
Yeah. Justin, I'm curious if you feel that's the same as well, where it's the personal experience that's sort of transformed someone's perspective on assisted dying.
Yeah, the personal experience. Obviously, I wear this badge. This is we carry with us when we go around, and it just says choice. Simple word, and the message is in it that there is a point when you feel you have to make a choice, but it's when you go through the experience, and it's an experiential thing. But as a lawyer, and I deal with people uh, who are coming to the end of their lives. They make a will. I encourage them to carry out an enduring power of attorney in case they develop dementia or have Alzheimer's. But the other one is the Advanced Healthcare Directive, which makes it possible to at least put it down on paper. And once you start doing that, and you look at it, people begin to think, well, okay, there's more to this than meets the eye. Because while you might say, I don't want to be resuscitated, then you've got to explain under what circumstances would you not want to be resuscitated? Why would you not want CPR? And when it's explained and you understand that there are consequences, then it begins to, and I know by looking and talking to my own clients as we develop this conversation, that that's all it needs. It's conversation. And conversation about death is critical to awareness. And unless that takes place, people will always view it with suspicion. But that's my experience as a lawyer.
Yeah. Thanks, audience member, for that question. Next up, how do conversations about assisted dying intersect with the broader discussions about disability rights, access to palliative care, as well as general health care? I know that the both of you had mentioned a bit about some of the official body positions being that palliative care is good enough, or that the way that the system works presently is sufficient for providing end-of-life care. But I'm curious if there's anything else that you thought to mention about that intersection.
Well, when it comes to vulnerable people, of course, this is always a concern and discussed in Iceland. People that are having concerns about, they say we are fighting to stay alive. We are fighting for the right to live, so we're not going to fight for the right to die.
Mhm.
People often have concerns also about coercion, so that it's not free will, but someone pushing them into taking this decision, making this decision about assisted dying. Unfortunately, in Iceland, we don't have an advanced healthcare directive. We had it from 2005 until 2015, and we have been fighting for it ever since. But this is, of course, a very important thing. And also, palliative care is not available throughout the country. It's mostly available in the capital area and then in the northern part of Iceland in the two biggest hospitals. But apart from that, if you live in a rural area, you won't have access, or it's not very easy for you to have access to palliative care. And we also have a lack of specialized palliative care
Mhm.
physicians. So that makes the conversation very difficult when they say palliative care is enough. But how many people actually have access to palliative care? That remains to be seen.
Yeah, yeah. Justin, just before I move on to the next question, just wanted to see if you had anything to contribute.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the environment where you have critics who will argue the point, and when you meet those arguments, how do you deal with them? For instance, um, it is often it's the language about which we speak is conflated. So when somebody addresses assisted dying as suicide, it immediately conjures up a vision or a view that this is morally insane. Why would you ever pass a law that encourages people to kill themselves? So the word kill, the word suicide, are highly pejorative expressions, and the manner in which they're put forward, in its own way, causes people to shy away from the subject because we take a view that what assisted dying is and voluntary assisted dying is not about shortening life. It's about shortening death. It's about understanding that you're taking pain away, and while in the process you accelerate the end of life, you do so in order to inspire a peacefulness, stillness, and take away the pain and the anguish, take away the anxiety and the cause and effect that that has for other members of a family. So the compassionate thing to do is to allow somebody determine how it should be done in that way. So language is important, and language and how it's used uh, is persuasive. Uh, and again, it's how the conversation develops that we will find and that we will learn.
Thank you.
I so much agree on this. We had a discussion in Iceland as well about, we never use the word suicide. And we always say it's not about choosing between life and death. We are shortening suffering.
Yes.
That's what it's about. Like you say, a compassionate way of dealing with end of life issues.
Mhm.
Yes. Yeah. For my next question, this audience member is curious about What do you see as the most realistic next steps for the assisted dying movement in both Iceland and Ireland over the coming years, and what meaningful progress looks like for you? I think the short answer is to that is to have an assisted dying law, but just curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I think it's more than just an assisted dying law, because I think for those of us who have been campaigning now for a number of years, it's becoming increasingly aware that achieving the law itself or the change in the law isn't an end. It's part of the journey towards finding a solution. Because even in Canada now, as far as I know, that there is as I see it, you'll be more familiar, Amanda, with how the sentiment is operating throughout Canada, is that one's ability to leave an advance directive to say, this is how I want it to be done. But it's all also about the mental ability to be able to endorse that conviction when it comes to the actual moment when the act takes place. There can be, for instance, a change in mental condition. Their dementia may have set in. There may be some absence of ability to formulate a concrete way of doing it. I know in the Netherlands, they're a lot more sophisticated about how it's done. And the Dutch system of committees who review these review committees that are constantly monitoring the manner in which um, uh, these decisions, the, the moment when it happens,
Mhm.
that it's kept that way, and therefore it's constantly under review. It's in a state of flux, so it never sits. And there are no absolute rules. Every case is dealt with in a subjective way, so that there will be cases when people who genuinely don't want to linger for any reason, because modern science can keep us alive for decades longer than they could just a generation ago. Um, so that I see as part of our cause in looking forward. We're not going to see the end. In my lifetime, it will still be there will be changes and the regulations will be there and updated, just as they were recently in Victoria, where they acted on review. And every 5 years, they go back to the drawing board and they'll say, well, what's going wrong and how can we perfect it?
Yeah, if
Ingrid,
I
same for
speak
you.
for Iceland,
Yeah.
I think, sorry, Amanda,
No.
I think one of the milestones we are looking at is to get the Icelandic Medical Association to come out of the closet, as we
Mm.
sometimes put it, because they don't want to participate in discussions. We have invited them to conferences, to be speakers, to take part in meetings, and they have always refused. It was not until 2023, when the Minister of Health did the survey, that they were willing to participate in the debate. But they say that the survey isn't good enough, so we urge them to do their own survey, which they kind of contemplated, but then kind of went back into the closet again, and we haven't seen them since. And the same goes for the Nurses Association. So that is something I would like to see in the next months and years, that we will have surveys among physicians, among nurses, and also to have a good discussion with politicians, because I think like I said, we have 36 new MPs. Many of them have never even thought about the idea of assisted dying. They don't know anything about it, so it's about informing them. But like I've often said, in Holland, it took 30 years from the moment the discussion started until the law came into force. I am positive that we won't have to wait 30 more years in Iceland.
Mhm.
Good, good. Now, we're out of time for today, but I have to end on this question. I'm curious about what gives you hope when you look at the future of assisted dying in Iceland and Ireland for you both.
Well, I trust the people around me, the people that I live with, and every day because I bring this topic up on a conversational basis every day I go to work, and I wear the badge, and it attracts attention, and people are far more willing to talk. That and it's also younger people who are now beginning to talk about it. So I'm experiencing that it didn't happen 10 years ago. And I notice it now. I know that I'm more aware of it now, but I know that the people that I speak with are much more open, and it's public opinion at the end of the day that will determine and decide what laws we pass. So I'm hopeful. I know that it will. And even during the week, one of our most strident politicians who fought against this while we were in the committee stage in the Parliament, it admitted that this was coming. He didn't agree with it, but it's coming.
Yeah, yeah. Ingrid, same for
Yeah,
you.
I agree. I agree with that too. I think younger people give me hope, especially young physicians or people that are still in medical school, because when we do an informal survey among those people, usually around 95% of people say that they support assisted dying. So it's kind of a matter of a change of generation, I think. But it's also hopeful that assisted dying, at least in Iceland, is more discussed. It's debated in parliament, in professional forums, in the media, and among ordinary people. And so the voices of patients, families, clinicians, carers are becoming more central. And it also, of course, gives me hope that we have at least a group of physicians that actually publicly support assisted dying. And this, of course, makes the debate more grounded, more compassionate, more honest. And I think that both Iceland and Ireland are gradually building the ethical, cultural, and institutional capacity to address end of life choices with care, humility, and respect.
Well said.
So I'm very
Yes,
hopeful.
here, 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 here. All right, that's all the time we have for today. Ingrid, Justin, thank you so, so much for joining us, especially towards the evening. It's quite late for them both in Iceland and Ireland, so we really appreciate the time and care that you took to provide your presentations, to share a little bit about what life is like across the pond for us. To our audience members, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your time and attention. We hope that you found this webinar worthwhile. It's thanks to the generosity of our supporters that we can continue to provide webinars like this, as well as all of our other compassionate services, 100% free of charge to people across Canada. With that in mind, we'd ask that you please consider paying it forward and empowering us to continue this work we do by making a donation today. And we've included a link for that as well in the chat. So thank you so much for your support. Justin, Ingrid, I wish you both and your organizations all the very best in the continued fight for assisted dying. And again, thank you so much for offering your time for us today.
Thank you.
You're very
Yes.
welcome.
Thank you. All right, everybody. That's it for today. We do have another webinar next week, Wednesday, February 18th at 3 p.m. Eastern, on what the data tells us about sex, gender, and end of life. So if you haven't registered already, make sure that you do so. Okay, that's it for today, everyone. Thank you and have a pleasant afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.